you have anything prepared for us, or are we just going to dive right in?
Well, I think I do have stuff prepared, but we were thinking about changing the topic last minute.
Okay.
What was it again?
At least one of the topics I want to talk about, and I'm not even sure if this will last longer than a cold open, and we'll see how much you disagree with me. But here's the thought. I've thought this multiple times. I do not think that there is anything intrinsically morally wrong from a Christian perspective with saying cuss words. I don't think there are a specific set of sounds that are just intrinsically sinful. I think it boils down to three different factors. And I think if you read the Bible, you read what Jesus says on this, you read what Paul says on this, you're going to find it consistent with what I'm about to say. There are three factors that determine the morality of your speech. Factor number one is, what is your subjective intent in saying that? That actually does matter. Factor number two, what is the rationally anticipated reaction you will get from your audience? Not how do they react, but how can you rationally anticipate them?
How would you expect them to react?
Yes. And then the third is the overall context of the situation. And so I think that's really what defines the morality of language, and I don't think it's about specific sets of syllables.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I get into an argument with a guy because he stole my parking space or something, and I'm just yelling at him, and I call him an SOB, that's wrong. I'm intending to insult him. He's going to get insulted. The context is a stupid fight that we shouldn't be having, conflict so that's wrong. That's wrong. If, however, I'm playing Halo with my friend Tyler, and he keeps killing me over and over and over and over and over again because he's better than me, and I gab him and call him an SOB. There's nothing wrong. In fact, it actually, in that moment, is building camaraderie. Because he knows I'm not meaning to insult him. He knows that we're just kind of trash talking each other because that's kind of how men operate. Men trash talk. It's banter, yes. And so that's not immoral at all.
So I have some questions. This is very
okay.
Because I kind of agree with you, but I think I diverge a little bit. So first question, is it okay for a child to cuss?
It depends on what you mean by okay. So
okay, let me say it this way. If you are talking to a 3-year-old and they go, yeah, I was playing with my toys and they were like effing this, that, whatever.
Here's what I'll say about that. So it is not about the specific set of syllables.
Yeah.
However,
we can both agree the sounds are not what make it bad.
Right. However, every language has certain words that it loads up with more emotion than other words because sometimes you need, and meaning, because sometimes you need that extra emotion and meaning to convey specific
I don't think
points.
you need it, and that's one of my big things.
Sometimes it is, perhaps you should say, more efficient. It's much more efficient to convey certain things with words that are packed more densely with emotion and meaning.
I could spend a lot of time unpacking that, but I won't let you cook.
Okay. So because of that, I think there's a general societal understanding that kids are not responsible enough with their language to wield that extra amount of linguistic power. And so, I don't think if that kid were to say that, I don't think he has sinned in the sense that he needs to go repent to God. But at the same time, I don't think that is a habit that is conducive to his growth as a person.
So would you
because he's not
to a kid playing with a lighter? Like a 3-year-old kid playing with a lighter?
Yeah, I can see that. It's like you shouldn't do that.
No,
but you're not going to hell.
Probably not. You're probably not going to hell.
But yeah, you shouldn't do it. It's bad.
Yeah.
Or playing with dad's power tools. Okay, you didn't drill your hand. That's good.
Yeah.
But there's a chance you will. There's a chance you'll wield this inappropriately. So let's not let you do that until you've got the maturity.
I can totally understand that. I have not heard that particular argument before. Most people think it's just bad for kids to say cuss words, and I think that's kind of ironic. It's like, what's different about the kid?
Well, I think they're morally intuiting what I'm describing. I've just spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about this. For some reason, that is unclear. I don't know why.
I think it's good to think about things like
So that's my take. I don't. That's why I don't get like when I watch TV with a whole lot of language, it doesn't bother me even slightly. In fact, I think that there are some stories you can't tell without all. So, for example,
You have an example? Yeah, I was about to say.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily.
Goodfellas cannot be told.
Which one's that?
That's the mob story with Ray Liotta.
See, that makes sense.
Goodfellas cannot be told honestly without a lot of language because that's how those people talk.
Yeah, but it's
You
also
cannot convey that. Yeah, well, no, even if it's the Godfather, for example.
real-ish. It's like it's it's reality adjacent, which means
Well, you're telling the truth about people.
yeah.
You have to adequately represent people in writing, and a lot
There are
of
some
people
people
cuss,
that you
and so you can't convey them properly. Same with like Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
You can't have Saving Private
Those
Ryan
people
without
have
a
been
language.
cussing.
Yeah.
And it's
And
to remove that removes part of the identity.
Yeah,
Oh.
I mean, if you watch Saving Private Ryan and Tom Hanks is going, darn it, that just doesn't.
Yeah,
It doesn't work.
it would be like everyone would be like, "Oh, I'm watching a movie."
That's why it's so shocking to people when they see Kirk Cousins mic'd up. So, for those of you who are not football fans, Kirk Cousins is an NFL quarterback. Was with the Vikings for a while. He's now with the Atlanta Falcons. He's your quarterback.
Man,
He is.
not my team.
He is a. Fair enough. He is a very devoted Christian, and he tries to live his life in a way that communicates that. So he does not cuss. Now, I have my disagreements with him, as I just articulated. I don't really think that's necessary, but that's what he feels personal about. I respect that. So he just does not cuss. So when you watch him mic'd up, because the NFL does the thing where they'll put mics on people while they're playing the game, and then they'll publish that later. It's hilarious because every other mic'd up situation, they're just constantly bleeping out all the cuss words because these are very intense, violent men.
Oh yeah.
Who cuss like soldiers because they kind of act like soldiers because they are kind of soldiers.
Yeah.
And then you get Kirk Cousins. And Kirk Cousins gets sacked. And on third down, he has to go to the bench because they're punting it. And he throws his helmet down and says, "Dang it!" And it just looks so incongruent. It's hilarious. It's so funny.
That takes will.
It does. I respect the will. No, unfortunately, I think he's probably a little bit woke. So that's the unfortunate part of him. I only think that I don't know that for sure, but he was up in the north for a long time. So
I got you.
it happens. But I think he's overall good. And if you watch the quarterback documentary by Peyton Manning, the first season that he did, it follows Kirk Cousins. I gained so much more respect for Kirk Cousins after watching that I started rooting for the Vikings.
That's cool.
And now that he's with the Falcons, I'm kind of rooting for the Falcons because I just like Kirk Cousins a lot. He's just a good dude.
Yeah.
Good dude.
That's
So
interesting, especially these days.
he also bilked Atlanta out of like all of their money. And he has the best contract negotiator on planet Earth. He's getting so overpaid, but it's anyway. So
I think you're closer. So on one hand, we've got you saying like it's fine to cuss as long as you meet certain requirements, and then we've got most, we'll say, typical mainstream Christians at least
who don't even think about the issue and they just say it's bad.
They're just like cussing is bad because it's bad.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of in the middle. I think, like you said, I think some stories cannot be told without cussing, but then that also gets into the whole realm of what I think is very interesting of like how far is it okay to go in theater, which
A good question. I've actually got a very specific opinion on that, which is that really the only line that shouldn't be crossed is the sex line, and that's because sex is fundamentally different than all the other sins that you see on TV.
I agree with that.
Let's get to that in a
But
second.
that might be a good second topic.
We'll go ahead and just open this up. This is probably what's
yeah.
going to be for the rest of the show. So,
Yeah, this was going to be a cold open, but it just kept going.
yeah. Welcome to the world from Reagan's garage. We
Yeah.
are not in Grandma's attic today. Unfortunately, Reagan was having car issues, so I'm down here with him.
Yep.
So, welcome to the world from Reagan's garage. We are, well, let's go ahead and continue talking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you've gotten this far, you pretty much know what you're going to get.
Yep.
So what I find interesting about whether or not cussing is okay, I do think intent really does factor into it a lot.
A lot.
However, I think I like your 3 criteria that you had, which I would slightly reword.
And I'm a lawyer, so we love our 3-factor analysis.
We're on the internet, so let's search it.
Yeah.
But I think I would reword it slightly, and you can tell me whether you agree with this, to be what matters, and this is more maybe layman's terms, but what matters of whether something, we'll say, qualifies as cussing specifically, cussing being language you should not say. We're just going to leave it at that for now. We can delve into that in a minute. Cussing would be dependent, or whether something is cussing depends on your intent. It depends on the context, like you said. And it depends, I think, on the context linguistically around the word you're using.
To a certain extent, that can factor in, although I'd put that in the third category as a subcategory of that category.
That's fair.
I think that matters. However, you also have to take into account the fact that language does morph and change over time.
Oh, absolutely.
So, for example, the F word does not mean what it used to mean in most contexts.
Oh, it does, though.
In most contexts, the way it depends on how you use it. But the way a lot of people use it, it actually has no meaning at all. The way a lot of people use the F word is general expletive.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. It means literally general expletive.
They use it as yeah, it is used in that way, but I think the number of times that it's used in that way where there's not some part of the person's brain that is aware of the alternative meaning, and I can explain this in a second, I think the number of times that happens is very low. Sometimes
no.
like blurt out, you're not thinking about it.
Here's where I disagree.
If someone wants to talk about the act that the word comes from, I don't know if it originates there because no one really knows where it comes from, but it has two meanings.
Oh, sure.
And I cannot, like, for example, I cannot say I want to, and that's not a great example, but
I don't think
I cannot say I want to bridge the gap without you imagining in some capacity a bridge between two places. But I'm not talking about an actual
yes,
word.
but I'm saying you can say the F word without associating.
I don't think you can.
Here's the thing. I think there are certain uses where I think it's wrong. I think if you're the kind of person who's sitting here talking about how many chicks you've effed, there's a problem. That's a big problem. Because you should not be describing.
We're around very different communities. That's an extremely normal way to use it.
Oh, I know it's an extremely normal. It's just only one. It's one way to use it. There are also.
If you're talking about how many people you've effed, and then 3 seconds later or 5 minutes later you say F, you cannot tell me that those are two different words because they're not. They're one word with two meanings.
Yeah, and so
you can change meanings
when you say it with one,
all attached to the same word.
But when you say it with one meaning, it has a different moral connotation than when you say it with another meaning. So, for example, if I'm driving my car and someone pulls out in front of me and I almost rear end them and I scream the F word, that's very different than talking about how many chicks I have. Very, very different morally speaking.
It is.
Very
but
different.
I think that other connotation makes that word, in a sense, dirty.
Except, maybe in a sense dirty, maybe perhaps I'd use the term vulgar. But
I don't like vulgar because that is an ancient Catholic way of referring to lowly people who aren't clergy.
That's
vulgar was common folk. They made it common. Literally.
No, because vulgar was used far before the Catholic Church was even
in Latin.
But the
Roman way of saying regular folks who are less fool than us.
But the meaning of vulgarity is a kind of dirt. So people might
it's
the kind of dirty
over time, but I don't think it ever truly loses its full meaning. I think it just kind of like hides. I don't actually subscribe to that belief in language. I think that
language is purely subjective. That's the problem. That's the reason why.
I think it's 90 to 95% subjective. I think there is an objective element to nature, to language, specifically in the fact that it comes from somewhere. And I think language.
But here's where it comes from. It comes from a whole bunch of people deciding that this word means that, because if we don't all get together and decide on definitions, then we can't communicate with each other.
That's not true at all.
That's
That's
what we're watching right now. We can't agree on the definition of woman, and so we can't communicate with each other.
Sorry, that's not what I agree that definitions are important for that reason. But what I find very interesting, and this is I'm an armchair linguist for just for context. So I'm not fluent in a lot of languages, but I study languages, and it's as a hobby. I'm not going to claim to be like some PhD master or something like that. But for example, I can write in Futhark and Futhork runes, which are Old English, essentially, and Old Norse. I can read slowly, but I can read Old Norse. I can speak and read and write a fair amount of Spanish, and there are a few other languages and stuff, but also Elvish, Lord of the Rings, because it's fun. The reason I'm mentioning that is because I find it interesting studying language. The depth behind behind every single word is a lot deeper than most people give it credit for. And
Sure.
the difference between a definition, there are two different kinds of definition you can have for a word. There's the dictionary definition. This is my terminology, by the way.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily official terminology. There's the dictionary definition, which is like, like apples are this fruit. And then there's the encyclopedic definition, which would be like apples are this fruit, but you can also use it in like these phrases, and this is the connotations around it. And if you call this kind of thing an apple, it means this. If you call this kind of thing an apple, it means this. Or if you use it as a verb, it means this. I'm just using apple because it's a random word that came to my mind. But that's an encyclopedic understanding. And what separates someone who is not very good at the language from someone who's fluent in the language, a lot of the time, is the fluent person has an encyclopedic knowledge of the language from using it over years. They've built up a massive encyclopedia, not a dictionary in their head. And I don't think dictionaries accurately represent the language. I think they represent a quick reference to give you a starting point toward understanding the language.
Sure, I agree with that. So
Point being, there's a lot more meaning in each word than most people realize.
Okay.
And
I agree with that to an extent, although at the end of the day, all language is a mode of communication that we can all agree upon. So the agreement
You
is
don't have to agree for it to be language.
no, but you do have to agree
For it
to
to be
use it to communicate.
Yes.
To be effective. You like
I would argue you only need like somewhere between 70 to 90%, somewhere in that range. If you're in that range of agreement on terms, you can actually communicate about anything
Sure.
non-essential.
Sure, in non-essential
Really
goes
effectively.
key. So
Essential thing, non-precise.
here's what I'm getting at when it comes to the evolution of language. I don't care what the word woman means, as in
The word is
the what
a word is an ephemeral concept.
exactly the particular syllables. I don't really care.
Yeah.
What I care about is the concept underneath.
Mhm.
And so, if you want to call women blue gorps and men blars,
Senoras.
yeah, I don't care.
Senoras.
But here's what is absolutely crucial to the functioning of society. We have to agree that that is the term that applies to that concept.
So,
Otherwise, we can't communicate.
for example,
Because if I say the word tree and I'm talking about a house, but you think I'm talking about a tree, we're not communicating.
yeah, like, okay, for example, let's say you and me are talking, and I'm like, hey man, I'm exhausted. Can you fill my car for me? And you're like, what?
Fill your car? What do you mean?
And then we get in a whole big argument, and I'm like, just fill my car. It's not that big of a deal. And you're like, what do you mean? I drove to another state to come here to be here, and you want me to go fill your car? And it turns out that by car I meant this.
Cup.
It's a cup. It's a mug.
Yeah.
And it's like that's a
You
very
cannot have a functioning society if
Exactly.
you can't agree on those definitions.
which is why it's important to define what you're talking
Yes, but the particular syllables don't actually matter as long as it's the thing we've agreed on.
If I instead of talking about filling my car, I talk about filling my blork. But we know from an inside joke from years ago, one time someone called a mug a blork.
Inside joke's actually a good
Yeah,
demonstration.
it would be idiomatic. It would be
Yeah,
idiomatic.
yeah.
Then like that's a whole.
So here's where I'm bringing it back to the
Mhm.
words have different meanings based on different contexts.
Yeah.
You see this in Hebrew a lot. Hebrew has a much smaller vocabulary than English, and words or Greek, words have different meanings depending on context.
There's a whole thing about English vocabulary I'm not going to get into. But
Okay.
anyway, English
Words-
is artificially inflated. But keep going.
That doesn't surprise me actually. But words, same word can mean multiple different things, right? In Hebrew or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and it depends on context.
That's in every.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, when you stub your toe and you scream a cuss word, you're saying a different thing than when you call somebody that same cuss word. You are meaning two different concepts. You are referring to different
So
concepts.
here's my question: why did your brain reach for the F word instead of say, ah?
Because that is also the term upon which we've agreed means general explanation.
See, I don't think that. But why did we agree that? And by the way, that agreement, real quick, that agreement isn't like it's not an actual consensus. It's just people started doing it.
That it's agreement by
And enough
because
people
it's an
did
implicit
it.
agreement.
It's less of an agreement and more of just a trend that people jumped on.
It's an agreement.
I think that's
You're agreeing.
you're an attorney, so I see why you see it as an agreement.
Because you're all agreeing to use the term that way. And by me using the term that way, I am implicitly agreeing to the premise.
Participating in an existing agreement.
Yes.
I can see that. Okay.
So, the reason you can argue that maybe we shouldn't have adopted the F word that,
Sure, that's a whole.
but we did, and now it means two different things.
But
So
I think
maybe-
its meaning is still an intentionally vulgar exclamation of anger.
I think it's an intentionally
I think the vulgarity.
emotion-filled,
Absolutely.
but that's not necessarily
You can express
wrong.
the exact same emotion with a non-word like
I don't think so.
You can't, except you actually. It's interesting because you kind of made my point for me. You can, except if you use the F word, it's dirtier. It's intrinsically dirtier because you said it with that word. Because that's part of the intent of using that word.
The intent of the word is to convey more emotion. To convey more.
Not more emotion.
To convey more. Yeah.
You do not. Okay, this is something that drives me nuts. There's nothing about the F word that is a stronger emotion than other words. That's not all it is.
The way it is used is that way. So there's nothing intrinsic about the collection of syllables, but the way it is used is I say crap when I mean a certain level of emotions, and then I say more cuss words when I mean more emotions. The way it is used. That is the way that culture uses it. It doesn't have to be that way, because that is the way culture uses it.
I'm saying it doesn't just mean more emotion. That's not all there is to it. And I don't think it has to be emotion. Because if it does have to be intrinsically, using the F word is more emotion than say dagnabbit. I'm just picking an example.
Which it is.
Which
it doesn't have to be.
It's
just the way that society is.
Why is that word so much stronger? And I think the reason it's stronger
because we've agreed that it is.
No, that's like
because again,
you're not
language
answering the question. Because I said so.
There is no objective reason for that. There is no objective reason for why words mean what they mean, except for we've agreed that that's the term we will use.
See, I think
there is no particular reason that we call a tree TREE, except for the fact that, well, going back to, yes, I know we got our language from other languages. You follow that trail all the way back to the beginning. It's just a collection of syllables that we thought kind of made sense in the moment.
First of all, actually, genuine question: how do you know that? How do you know?
What else would it be? What else would it be?
There are people that genuinely believe things like God gave humanity language.
I don't believe that.
Okay, so you are saying a belief about something you genuinely cannot prove it.
I don't believe. I think language was given by God in the sense that they
believe Hebrew is like.
I know, and so do the Arabs, the Muslims. I do not. I don't subscribe to that belief. My belief is that God gave us a rational will by which we have created language as a method of communication. I'm not even convinced God speaks a language in the way that humans conceive of language, except for as a way of communicating with humans.
Language is also a much broader topic.
I'm not convinced that God's language per se has anything to do with syllables or anything like that, the way that we think of it. And so that's why I say language is a human construct. It's a human construct. We created it as a method of communication using the rational wills that God gave us. And so there's nothing intrinsically meaningful about the particular set of syllables we decided to use to describe a certain thing.
So real quick,
the thing that's important is that we agree that that particular set of syllables means that thing.
Because
if we don't agree, yeah, that's fine.
So you were defining a word as sounds.
Yes, sounds.
Okay. The sound waves that make up the F word.
Yeah.
Those are utterly meaningless.
Yes.
We agree on that.
Yes.
We agree on that.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to argue to me that the F word, once it leaves your mouth, is a completely meaningless string of things that will eventually run into someone else's eardrums if they're nearby, and they will translate it into what I would call
a concept.
A concept. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. To me,
and the concept,
we're defining word differently.
Yeah. Well, the concept.
Which is why it was. Yeah.
Okay.
I just think that's interesting.
That's kind of ironic, actually.
Yeah. I have the definition.
So the concept that is triggered by the particular sounds is determined by the environment you grew up in, meaning what language is spoken around you as you're growing up, as you're learning, what language is agreed upon in your. That's what determines what concept is brought up in your brain.
And there are African languages. There's probably a bunch of languages, but I just know of at least one language somewhere in Africa. I don't know where, because I just got this from like a quick flip. But the dude was talking about a language in some African country where they have the F word. It's obviously spelled differently because they have a different alphabet and stuff. But the F word means like, I'm just making stuff, but it's like tree or something, or like
exactly, exactly.
Which is why I think you're partially right, and I think you're right that sounds in and of themselves are intrinsically meaningless.
What you have to think about is what concept is being brought up in the listener's mind. That's
exactly.
What
And to me, the word, when I talk about a word, I'm talking about a sound plus the effective encyclopedic definition that goes along with that.
I agree.
For the speaker and the listener.
But I think that encyclopedic definition is context dependent. And I think it can trigger one thought based in one context and another thought in another.
Let me just settle one thing real quick. I do not believe there's anything intrinsically wrong with the sounds that make up the F word.
Yes, so for example, if I'm alone in my car, the way I see it, if I'm alone in my car, I can say whatever I want.
See, this is where I disagree with you because those sounds are not meaningless. So
yeah,
if you're going
they are.
No, they're not.
Because they have to be interpreted by a listener in order to, or by myself.
You're a speaker.
Yeah, so it depends on my subjective meaning.
But that's the thing you consciously choose.
That's the only factor.
You cannot consciously choose to ignore all of the context around the F word just because you want to say it for some other reason. That context is still baked into your understanding of the word.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, if I'm alone in my car, if we're not dealing, if it's an audience of,
so the context is just
context is just me, audience of one.
And God,
yeah, sure, but God understands me. I don't have to worry about God misinterpreting my intentions.
True.
So all that matters in that moment is my subjective intention.
Mm-hmm.
What am I intending to convey to myself, really, by saying these words? And I'll tell you what I often do is when I'm driving, I will just cuss like a sailor in some foreign accent, just for the fun of it. Simply because it's fun. Sometimes I'll do a Boston accent.
Why?
Because the different accents roll off the tongue.
Accents are very fun. That's not
and so the particular words, I don't know, they're kind of fun to say. They're funny.
I know.
They're funny.
I'm saying, why are they funny? Let's dig into that.
I think they're funny because I'm presenting a caricature of a type of real person that I find to be humorous. And I'm living out that caricature. So for example,
so you're doing it as fun. See, that's very different than just randomly spouting cuss words in your car.
I know. I switched topics a little bit.
Yeah.
So
I'm saying
I'm enjoying a caricature of a person. So for example, if I'm like a Boston, I'm doing a Boston accent, which I do quite frequently. And I'm just spewing cuss words like a Matt Damon.
Yeah.
I'm basically just making fun of Matt Damon, essentially, in that moment. And it's fun. Yeah. It's fun.
And in that case, I think that would fall under acting, which again is a much more complex topic to me.
It actually is somewhat complex.
There's a lot of nuance, I think.
There is. There's more nuance.
So I'm willing to take that specific thing and put that into the acting category as a separate content.
Okay, touche. Now, when we get to the point
if you're just randomly saying cuss words in your car because you feel like saying the words, or because you're angry, what I'm trying to get at, I think the reason you are drawn to it, you as any human, I think if you're conveying anger, sure. I think the reason we're drawn to those specific words when we want to convey anger is the inherent, in our cultural context, the inherent vulgarity of the words, to use your term from earlier, the inherent, I'm going to use the more dirtiness of the word, and I'm using that intentionally for a reason that I'll get to in a minute. The inherent dirtiness of the word lines up with the emotion you were trying to express, and so you are matching the dirt that's in your heart with the dirt on your mouth.
Except for, here's the thing. I don't think I'd use the word dirt because I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with being angry, for example. Anger is a negative emotion, but it's not intrinsically wrong.
But lashing out in your anger is generally, I would say, almost always wrong.
I'd say most of the time,
lashing out.
Uncontrolled is the key.
Rage.
But if it's controlled,
I think if you are releasing words from your mouth, that is a lack of control.
What are you talking about? No, if you intentionally
if you're angry,
then that's
no, there's a difference. So what intentionally releasing, let's say I'm just going to use dang. Let's pretend dang is a bad word.
Okay.
because I want to keep this family friendly.
Yeah.
So let's say you get cut off in traffic. You're super mad. You've been having a bad day, and you get cut off, and you go, "Dang it!" That there was no intention there except for rage release.
Okay, in that context,
However,
you can make the argument.
the
that you're wrong.
intentional, if you're doing it intentionally, that would be something like you get cut off, and you're like, "I need to control myself. How can I release this emotion?" I will say, "Dang it, dang it!" Much better. No one does it. Literally. Okay, I've done it. Literally, only weird people do that. Our dad's a robot. That's why we can do that.
I don't know. Yeah, that's my business.
But do you do that every time?
No, I'm not saying. But that goes back to my point. It is context dependent and it's subjective intent dependent.
Yes.
So what you're
Which I agree with that.
So yeah. So what we're saying.
Playing word game.
So what we're saying here is there are some contexts in which your subjective intent is simply to lash out in rage in a very morally unacceptable way. In which case that's wrong.
Yes.
There are other times in which your subjective intent is to just release some emotion to just feel a little better because you know there's no one around you who's going to be harmed by it. So you're just going to release some emotion using a more emotionally compact word.
And I have done that. I can't say that doesn't happen.
And so in that context, there's nothing wrong with that. It depends on what's going on in your heart.
And
that's what matters. What's going on in your heart.
So there's a Bible verse, and this is where I was going with the dirty thing. There are a bunch of Bible verses about this actually. I don't have them memorized because I'm not that good of a Christian. That was a joke for those of you listening and who can't see my face. Do we have an audio only version of this?
You know,
we could totally put it.
I'll make one.
Anyway,
I actually have.
I don't want to give you more work.
I have the infrastructure to do that. Actually, it shouldn't be too
It
terrible.
literally just occurred to me.
I'll try to do it.
Anyway, so where was I? Sorry, I got distracted. ADHD problems. We were talking about intent.
Yeah, your intent to just sort of release some emotions using the word.
Yes. Oh yeah. There are Bible verses about words. So you've got things that are more tangentially related, like the tongue is the sword and it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And then there's a verse along the lines of where your words are.
Your heart.
Your mouth speaks from the over.
Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Thank you. Yes, that one. So that implies to me when your heart overflows, if what comes out is dirty, then that means the heart.
But I'm saying there are not those words are not intrinsic. Sometimes those words are not
In our culture, they are intrinsically dirty.
Not anymore. I'd say perhaps in the 1920s. You're right, but the meaning over the past 50 years has changed dramatically. It really has.
Okay, so genuinely, I 100% disagree on this.
Okay, so I think that's where our disagreement is. I don't actually think we're disagreeing on the concept. We're disagreeing on the facts on the ground.
Yeah, I think
because I
experiential difference. Yeah.
Well, but I'm
not talking about my. So I'm a programmer by trade. I write software, and software developers cuss like sailors.
Everyone does that. That's my point.
It started with the culture.
What industry?
You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
Everyone cusses like sailors.
Everyone does.
I don't think sailors don't even cuss like sailors anymore. They cuss more than what sailors used to cuss.
Yeah. My point is just to people who are in a Christian bubble, that is the place which happens a lot in the South. That's the place where cussing is not really seen.
That's the only place. Though.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's the place where you don't see cussing. Is in Christian bubbles, and we're approaching this from a Christian worldview.
Yeah.
So that actually is relevant.
Yeah.
But coming from a development background, software engineering, where people do cuss like sailors, which is probably largely because they mostly are Christians.
Yeah.
And it's very much a cultural thing. And they cuss over stupid things, like there's no reason to use a vulgar word.
It's very trivialized.
Yes, but let me tell you, I've had conversations with a lot of people who just cuss randomly. There's a large portion of people who do cuss like that and don't think it's okay. And I would argue if you don't think it's okay, you are intrinsically adding, you every time you use that word that you don't think is okay to use, you are adding that not okay to it.
But that's an if, though, which means it's not a constant.
It's not absolutely everyone.
You're right. That's my point.
That's not my whole argument. That's not my whole argument, though. That's one facet. my thing is more, I think in our culture, well, so I think our culture has degraded in such a way that it is becoming desensitized to certain vulgarities, for lack of a better term. Cursing, cuss words and stuff are seen a lot more people see it like you than used to. I think personally,
but we've just developed more cuss words in its place. That's the we have developed more cuss words.
What do you mean?
The same prohibition that people in, say, the 1700s, 1800s Victorian England would have had against using the F word in public are now applied to other words. That's why I said Victorian England, because that was notorious for not being that.
It was, I'm saying it was more like that than you actually. The cussing there are like written records and stuff. But anyway, if that's a whole other thing, don't worry about that right now. Keep going. Pretend.
Those similar prohibitions are now in place with different words. So, for example, we went from considering words that derive their root in animalistic behaviors like the B word or the F word, which is a very animalistic thing. We went from those being the proscribed words to racial slurs being the proscribed words. And now racial slurs are absolutely proscribed. Cannot be
proscribed meaning
cannot
bad language.
Meaning you are
not allowed to say it.
Not allowed to say
Culturally.
Yeah. So we've just sort of moved the taboo.
See, this is interesting.
But here's the thing. In the process of moving the taboo off those words, first, people used those words with impunity, understanding their meaning. But over time, because people started using those words with impunity, it actually diluted the meaning, such that now there's a whole separate meaning to all sorts of cuss words that is just simply general expletive. There are so many situations in which someone screams a cuss word and he might as well just be saying general expletive, except for that's too many syllables.
I genuinely don't believe that general expletive is in and of itself actually a thing. Isolate. I don't believe it's isolated from the word. I think the word you use says.
Yeah, I think it is. That's our disagreement.
However, I realized something a second ago. I'm willing to make an exception to what I've been saying because I just thought of something. I think so. You're very low on conscientiousness. I'm very high on conscientiousness.
Yeah, we were talking about
the Big Five personality testing.
Actually, hold on. Pause for a second.
You may see where I'm going with this.
I don't. But let's just tell our audience our Big Five personality traits. So
I'm high on all five.
Yeah, he's high on all five.
Like literally, my lowest one is like 75%.
I'm low on conscientiousness, but very high on extroversion. Very low on agreeableness. I'm very disagreeable.
Surprise!
Surprise! I'm very low on conscientiousness, embarrassingly low. And I'm kind of, if I remember right, middle of the pack. So there you go. There's our personality types. Now continue. I'm low on conscientiousness.
Yes, I'm very high on conscientiousness. I wonder how much of it, I wonder if what you've been arguing is only true for people who are low on conscientiousness. And I would be curious, just on a moral level, I'm curious whether there are two things I can see, because what you're saying from a low conscientiousness, like not very, let's see, how would you describe low conscientiousness? So conscientiousness is like self-awareness and like awareness of,
and discipline, and discipline is factored in there. And you know what?
Yeah.
Let's Google it. Let's Google it.
Definition.
Definition of conscientiousness in Big Five personality.
Yeah.
See, I'm like an old man. I use the voice text. A personality trait of a person who shows awareness of the impact of their own behavior on those around them and on themselves. Conscientiousness is a trait that shows thoughtful, goal-oriented, and controlled. So thoughtful, goal-oriented, and controlled.
And it comes from conscious. It's
Yeah,
conscious.
you're conscious. You're aware.
Yeah. So there are two things I could see with this. I could see if you're low conscientiousness, I could totally see a scenario where it genuinely your words are meaningless, and so you can say whatever the heck you want. Who cares? I could also see a scenario where, as a low conscientiousness person, you would be completely, totally, and utterly unaware of the impact and unable to see it. It would be effectively invisible to you, and so you wouldn't be able.
When you say impact, though, that implies there are other people.
including to yourself. I think the words you say, actually, scientifically speaking, words you say affect your brain.
Sure.
You can literally, if you have talked
So
to
that's
yourself
what
all
you
day,
mean.
you'll end up more confident.
If that's what you mean by that, I agree.
And vice versa.
So that is an interesting question, how conscientiousness affects the use of language. That's an interesting question. I do genuinely believe that there are many times in which people use words that are just sort of meaningless.
But you're also a little
Just listen to Kamala Harris talk. I don't think she understands half of the stuff she says.
That's different.
She's an empty suit.
That is very different than what I'm trying to talk about. Because there's a difference between just being dumb.
True.
And just to be clear, I am not suicidal. Just throwing that out there.
You're not calling Hillary Clinton dumb.
No, that's true. That's true. No, she's brilliant.
She's intelligent, scarily so.
Scares me. Scares the heck out of me. But her and her friends are very
Very intelligent, yeah.
Yes.
You can get away with that many murders. You're pretty smart.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder how much of it has to do with you being low conscientiousness. And then I'll have to think about this. Does being low conscientiousness exempt you from the rule of languages potentially bad, of like
If
bad
it is-
or bad?
If my
Or
point
does
is,
it just make you oblivious to what you're doing?
if my point is that it is so wrapped up in subjective intent and anticipated reaction and context, if you follow my framework, then by your logic, conscientiousness would exempt you. And that's low conscientiousness because you're not, wow, I have random cramp on my side. Oh my goodness. Conscientiousness would affect the way that you see that. So it would affect your subjective intent. It would affect the way that you view the way that you interact with it, and it would affect the overall context.
Yeah, and I'm going to be just fully honest here. Part of the reason I'm arguing at this point, because I feel like we've kind of reached an accord, part of the reason I'm arguing now is because I don't like that result. And I want to see if I can disprove it. And so if I can prove it wrong, then I'll feel better about it. But I see where you're coming from. I think my biggest disagreement with this overall is with your opinion on this is I'm not convinced that language is purely only without exceptions objective. I think there's objective elements or
That's where we disagree.
Yeah, and honestly, like if I didn't know you so well, the fact that you only know one language would completely I would just not even consider your opinion. But I know you, and I know you think well. Seriously, knowing monolingualism is like it makes it hard to fully comprehend certain concepts.
Okay.
When you're talking about language, especially monolinguists do not understand if you know only one language, you don't know how language works. It's a fact.
I think you're
everywhere. And if you get good at another language, you start to see it.
Yeah, I've studied enough about language to understand. You have to understand. In some ways, I'm not monolinguistic because in some ways
you've done some studying about it.
Well, in some ways, you could call legalese a different.
Oh, absolutely. I would.
In some ways, no, it's English, but the way
part of English, it's largely not. It's a different language.
But
what
I'm really more talking about is the fact that when you have a legal education, you are taught to break down and understand language.
Well,
that's one of the core components.
And same with programming. Funny enough,
programming is a language. Yeah,
it is very much a language.
Absolutely.
And one thing I find and that's actually where my first that's a whole other tangent. I could go on about language all day. But programming, like you are multilingual if you learn programming, because you're learning programming languages. That word is used intentionally. What I find fascinating, the more you learn about language, the more you can kind of abstract it out to not turn things into languages, but you start seeing a lot of things, at least I have, as language. For example, you've got English as a language, right? But English is actually like a conglomerate of English, French, and Latin. English is the German language.
Yeah.
It literally is German.
Yeah.
It's just, if you go back far enough, they have the same parents. Of course, if you go back far enough, so does Hebrew, but that's a whole other thing.
If you go back far enough, you'll end up with one language according to the biblical tradition.
That's a whole other can of worms. We're not going to go there right now.
Go back before the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Oh, that's true.
That's what I'm talking about.
Oh, I see. Okay. I do have some spicy takes about that time period, but that's for maybe later. Bring it up later if you want to.
Interesting.
But when you get down to it, a language is basically the way I like to kind of define language. Something is a language if it is a way of communicating about a specific thing, or a mode of communication.
It's a method.
It's a
vehicle for conveying meaning is all that it is.
Yes. So I'm instead of trying to give like a dictionary definition, I'm going to do more encyclopedic. English is a language. French is a language. Obviously, we know those. Java, a programming language, is a language. It's just a language with a purpose.
Yeah.
Irish is a language. Gaelic is a language. There's a bunch of branches of that. It's actually a language family. Legalese is absolutely a language. Sign language is a language, and there's actually families.
I don't think legalese is distinct enough from English to call it a language.
Okay, so this is where we get into terms. But okay, I run out of mental examples. Sign language is actually really interesting, though, real quick, because families who are deaf, who grew up in kind of isolation, will make their own sign language. And they literally have their own language that is their family language, and it's very well documented.
That actually makes sense because you're gonna find some way to communicate.
Yeah, and you know that, and you may also be aware of there's a trope in like westerns of the isolated inbred community who is like a family where they're all interbreeding with each other because they're totally isolated in their own community, and when they talk to each other it sounds like gibberish even though they're speaking English.
Yeah,
because they have so much. They're only with each other, and they develop so much extra language inside their English that it becomes a totally.
Well, there's an island off the coast of, I think, Virginia, maybe, where maybe it's off the coast of
where they speak Irish.
They speak it's like a totally weird dialect of one of those languages.
Yes, because they're just isolated.
Because they're isolated. Yeah, it's a super weird dialect, and if you go there, even if you're from America, you're like, "Whoa, what are these people saying?"
Yeah, but it is technically. When I say technically, according to modern scholars, most people would lump that into English. I think English is not a language, but that's a whole other thing. I think it's a composite language, is what I would call it. It's what happens when you snap a bunch of languages together. And but anyway, so that gets into the definition of language. We can get to that in a second.
Legalese isn't a language though because it is not distinct enough.
Okay.
That's my point.
So here we get to what distinguishes one language from another. The words they use.
Yeah.
The words they use, or the culture that uses them, or the subtext.
Well, when you're talking about language, primarily it's the words that are used.
Okay, in that case, what separates Latin from English?
They're different words. They share a lot of the roots, but they are different words.
Okay, so how different do the words have to be before they don't qualify as the same word?
Meaning they're different words. They don't have to be much different. Like, for example...
So if one letter is different?
That's a different word.
Okay. Then by that...
Love is a different word than love.
People speak a different language than...
You can make a much better case.
There are people that are arguing this, which is why
you can make a much better case that inner city black is its own language than you can that legalese is its own language.
For a language, for something to be a language... For something to be a language, does it have to be connected to a community in your mind?
No.
Okay.
Well, no. I'll take that back because
a community
the core
or a purpose, a community or a
because the core of it is it's built around communicating ideas. Yes, right.
If you know a language, truly know a language, you know that.
Okay, but here's my point. Here's the threshold of whether it's so distinct that it becomes its own language. Because most languages are kind of just branches off of other languages, right? But at a certain point, the branch becomes so distinct that it's its own unique entity. So what is that threshold? The threshold is you come from the mother language and you go into this community and start talking with them. How much are you going to understand?
Okay.
There's a threshold there.
Yes.
With legalese, if I pull up a case on Lexis and I just have you read a case, you will understand. Now, yes, you will.
I disagree.
You may not understand it 100%. A random person.
Because I'm not normal. I was raised by a
I know. A random person. Okay. You may not understand it to its full extent. You may not understand the nuances. You may not know how to you may not understand enough about the concept of precedent to know what the case means for society,
Okay.
but you will know what the judge is saying.
So here's a question.
You will understand the meaning of the words that he is using.
So if I take a contract, say some kind of simple contract, or not simple, and I want to understand it, and I take a dictionary and I look up the words to
You're
that
not
contract.
going to have to look up any words in the dictionary in order to understand. You're not.
Dude, you're way overestimating people's vocabulary.
Pull up. No. Pull up right now. No.
I'm talking about.
Pull up a thing.
Let's do an end user license agreement. That's
Pull up.
contract.
No. I'll do you one better.
Okay.
Pull up sample force majeure clause. I intentionally chose that
Sample
because the
force
name is a
majeure.
term. The name is a term of art, and so you're not going to know the name. You're not going to be familiar with
Which
the word force majeure.
do you know? So
You're
say that.
living the
I
time.
know, you're right. So say the name again.
Force majeure.
What language is that?
I believe French
Latin.
or Latin.
Actually, it's either Latin or French.
I believe it's French, but it could be Latin. I know.
Spell major.
So
for
what
me.
I'm saying-
Spell major for me.
If you type in force M,
That's
yeah,
right,
M-A, yeah.
Yeah.
So hold on. Before
You
we
want a
read,
sample for?
yes, sample force majeure clause. Before we read it on air, we're going to read it on air in a second. I have a caveat, okay? The caveat to what I'm saying is there are terms of art in the legal world that you're not going to understand unless you're familiar with yourself with it.
Yes.
But there aren't enough of those terms of art to warrant calling legalese its own distinct language.
See, I would argue that the terms themselves are the language, and we inject that language into English.
No, we've injected Latin into English. That's not its own language. We've just injected Latin into English. That's not legalese, it's Latin. Legalese
I don't
is-
consider Latin English, but anyway,
I know, I'm saying
That's-
you inject Latin into English,
and it becomes legalese. Is that
No.
what you're saying? Okay. I'm
it's
confused with what
just,
you're
it's English with a little bit of Latin in it. That's all it is.
saying. Legalese is.
Yeah, no, not legalese. I'm talking, this clause
Okay.
is English with a little bit of Latin in it, but it is not its own language.
Okay. So
It's
I'm going to read this out loud. This is
Yes.
a random example.
Okay, so
Okay.
hold on, pause.
Okay.
Challenge for the audience, challenge for you. What is this paragraph saying? Now read it.
I want to add to that.
Okay.
Because I think there's more to this linguistically than just that. So first, what is the paragraph saying?
Yes.
I think also, if you want to actually understand it in the context that matters for a legal situation, what is this saying? Plus, what are the subtexts? What are the other extra informations that
That's
you
where
should
you
know
get into
regarding?
dialect rather than whole other language.
And that's where I disagree. But first, let's just read through this.
Read it, and by the way, I picked this specifically because it has that Latin/French title.
Yeah.
Almost, we really don't use a lot of Latin in the law anymore. We really don't.
It has
But
to
this
get
is
better.
one where we do. So read
So,
it.
force majeure. No party shall be liable or responsible to the other party, nor be deemed to have defaulted under or breached this agreement for any failure or delay in fulfilling or performing any term of this agreement, except for any obligations to make previously owed payments for the other party hereunder, when and to the extent such failure or delay is caused by or results from acts beyond the impacted. Okay, so first of all, my eyes are glazing over a little bit. I'm reading it this way, by the way, because there are no periods. Is this a bad one?
No. What I'm going to say here is there is a problem in the legal world with run-on sentences.
Yes.
That is a problem.
Yes.
So-
I would argue that is a feature of the language legalese.
No,
Legalese
it's a feature of English used in a particular context.
Let me make a caveat here. I think legalese is
Because there's
in large
French law,
part
and you're going to
modern language. Modern legalese, I think, is actually very closely related to not old English, but old modern English. The
Middle
1800, modern English,
Oh.
but the older version.
Oh, okay.
Modern means
Victorian English.
So there's Old English,
Victorian
Old English, and then Modern English, which goes from Shakespeare to now. So
Blackstonian English.
Blackstonian, maybe.
William Blackstone.
Okay,
Because
okay, very maybe.
he was
Very
the most
maybe.
influential legal scholar on the American minds,
Fair
the
enough.
American founding minds.
So and you could call this a dialect of English, and I think, however, if we call it a dialect for our current, a dialect of English, I'm content with that. I think if something is an
And
English
I-
dialect, I think personally that it would be more accurate to call it a language because
It is a language if you cannot understand what's going on without spending the time to learn it. So hold on, you have to finish.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. I haven't finished.
Before you know what's going on, you have
Yes.
to finish the sentence.
Okay. Where was I?
So you're not going to be
Impacted. Let's see. So I'm going to go back a little bit.
no party shall be liable or responsible for any failure to perform resulting from acts beyond the impacted party's reasonable control. So let's just put a period there. I know they didn't put a
So
period
he
there.
ignored, just so you know, he ignored like literally 30 words inside of parentheses.
And that, my friends, is how you lawyer.
That, my friends, is how you read legalese. You skip certain parts because you know in the language legalese there are parts that you don't read unless you need to, or they're only there
There are
for
parts
extra
that you
clarification.
skim because they're so boilerplate you already know what
That
that
is a linguistic
It's a
feature.
dialect.
It is not a dialect.
Not, so,
that
for
is-
example, no, here's my point. If you read that whole sentence in all of its glory,
Mhm.
all you have to do, the only tool you need to understand it
Mhm.
is time to sit down and parse it out.
That's exactly how you learn language.
Except if that were Spanish, no amount of time reading that would allow me to understand it. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's my point. You do not
I
need a
want to-
dictionary
there's a caveat.
to read that force majeure.
If you are not very, so we both have gone through college and were raised by an attorney, and I know from dealing with a lot of people that I know that were not in the same position.
Moving the camera.
I know, I didn't mean to. It should be moving the camera.
Oh wait, yeah, the camera's right there. I'm an idiot.
Okay,
Ignore me.
cool. I was like, wait, am I using the wrong camera?
I'm stupid.
So I know from talking with a lot of people, our grasp of language is far from normal because our dad's a robot.
But that doesn't mean it's a
I love
different language. It just means that there's degrees of grasp of language.
What I'm saying is, we can't use our understanding of language as the basis for whether other people understand it because our vocabulary is very big.
Okay, but my premise is not impacted by that statement.
I'm setting that.
I agree, but my premise is not impacted.
Sure, I'm not
You
impacting.
can't, I cannot read a Spanish sentence without pulling up a dictionary and figuring out definitions.
Sure. What I'm trying to
Anybody
say,
who speaks English can, with enough time and devotion, and it may take some low IQ individuals a lot of time and devotion that they're unwilling to spend, but they are capable of understanding the meaning of that sentence
so
without a dictionary.
So-
what word in there would you need a dictionary to understand?
for most people,
Yeah.
unless they have experience with loans, which to be fair, it's a lot of people, but defaulted. That is a legalized term. Normally that means
Fair.
your default setting.
Okay, two
That's
seconds.
most
You got
people
one.
in it.
Any
So,
other word?
let's
Because if
see.
there's just one term of art that you don't know, that's not a whole language.
Oh, sure,
Just
sure.
one term of art.
Well, I'm arguing that the terms of art as a whole are a separate language that is.
But that's incomplete. That's not a whole language.
There was at least one more.
Okay. What does this
There
sentence mean?
is.
What does it mean?
I'm gonna have to read it again to be honest.
Read
I
it
don't
again.
remember.
No party. In fact, I'll shorten it
No,
for
no.
you. I'll
Okay,
shorten it
okay,
for you.
tell me your version of it that is translated into English. You're literally translating for me.
No.
That's your job. You are a translator. What did someone hire an attorney to do? They had hired you to interpret.
But there are
Into
you can understand every single word on that list. I am helping you speak the dialect, but the language is the same.
So if a dialect requires an interpreter, unless you want to spend a very long time learning the dialect, doesn't that make it basically a language?
No, I'm saying the threshold is: is it possible to do it all on your own?
Theoretically possible to do it without a dictionary.
Yes, that's the threshold.
Okay.
So I can walk into downtown Atlanta and I can understand probably 75-80% of what they're saying without a dictionary.
surprised, to be honest.
No, I can't. I've been to downtown Chattanooga.
Not even close. To
Okay.
say. But anyway,
The point maybe
you might be able to.
maybe I'm wrong,
It depends on who's around.
but I'd say you've got a much
Wide
better
variety of people.
case saying that's a different language than this, because
Also, downtown Atlanta, you'll hear just about anything. You'll hear like
well, it's fair. You'll hear
Ukrainian,
anything.
you'll hear Chinese, you'll hear
But with this
Spanish.
sentence, every single person who is moderately capable of wielding the English language. So not children, not people who speak English as a second language, not particularly low IQ individuals,
That's interesting.
but most people who are moderately capable of wielding the English language are going to be able to, with enough time, sit down and figure out what that sentence means.
So
what they are not going to do, probably, is spend the time to do it. They'd rather pay me to do that for them.
Let's say I sit down, I read this contract.
What does it mean?
Well, hold on. Let me finish my
Okay.
Let's say I sit here and I spend the 4 hours it takes me to parse this paragraph. Let's say that for some reason it's the only paragraph in the whole contract.
Okay.
Just for ease of communication. So I sit down and I spend like 4 hours reading through this paragraph and interpreting it. Will I have a full understanding of what it is what it is meaning in such a way that I can reasonably say, yeah, I understand this well enough that I have no issue whatsoever signing this contract?
Absolutely.
See, I don't agree at all.
With that force majeure clause, absolutely. So, for example, let's read it. I'm going to read it to you. No party shall be liable or responsible to another party, nor may it be deemed to have defaulted under a breach of this agreement for any failure or delay in fulfilling or performing any term of this agreement, except obligations made previously. Except for any obligations to make previously owed payments to another party hereunder. When and to the extent that such failure or delay is caused by results or acts beyond the impacted party's reasonable control. What does that mean?
So it sounds to me that it basically says no one's responsible for things outside of their control.
You will not be held liable or responsible
by this contract
for non-performance of the contract based on things that are outside your control.
Okay.
That's basically what you said.
Non-performance of the contract, meaning breaking it?
Yeah. Breach of the agreement, failure, or performing any term under the agreement.
Okay. So, I will grant you that this one overall is fairly simple. I still think that the structure of this is not a typical English structure. I think it's
atypical, but it's not its own language. It's just atypical.
So, I think I'm going to need to think about this a little more. But I see where you're coming from, and
by the way, it goes on to give examples of things that are outside your control that will excuse your non-performance. Yeah. So it explains it further. It defines force majeure events as things that purpose or frustrate the purpose of the agreement. A, acts of God. That is self-explanatory. Lightning strikes you dead. Okay.
It's self-explanatory if you assume.
B, flood, fire, earthquake, or explosion. C, war, invasion, hostilities.
Pause for just a second. Is this an exclusive or inclusive list? Like, does this include every single thing?
Including, without limitation. That's in there. We always make sure that all that stuff is in there. But that's good thinking. That's all you're thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. That is something that most people are not going to think of, and it's baked into the language of legalese.
But
if you don't,
it's still not distinct enough to call it. It is more distinct. It's not exactly the same. So it's not distinct enough to cross the threshold of being its own language.
If I use English words, but I restructure the grammatical structure of the sentence, is it still English?
There's a threshold in which it won't be, but legalese doesn't breach that threshold.
See, I think it at least rides really close. I'm cool to call this a really archaic dialect.
It is somewhat archaic. Yeah, you're right.
Less so than it used to be.
Much less so than it used to be.
Congress has passed some things I know saying I think it's Congress. I've seen some Gravy. I'm talking to you about this, so I'm because you're an attorney, you're up to date on all this stuff, so I'm gonna look like I don't know. But I saw a thing. Congress is trying to have laws, at least on a federal level, laws specifically written in more regular English.
I don't think that's a specific law that's been passed. What it is?
It's like a motion.
No, the only thing that I am basically familiar with is there is a concept in law where the law has to be understandable to the common man in order to be enforced upon the common man. Like if you're going to promulgate a law, you can't promulgate it in Greek and expect your English published.
No one uses that word except for attorneys.
No, I've heard it used by politicians,
people
who are in the law. So, okay,
law.
If you're going to publish a law, distribute a law, and expect people to follow it, you can't publish it in Greek and expect a bunch of English speakers to follow it. There is a concept in the law that it has to be understandable to the common man in order to be enforced. And so to that end, as
Is that why
language
you don't want
changes,
Legalese to be a language.
no, I don't care. I just don't think it is.
I-
So because of that, laws are people try to write laws in as plain English as they can. But here's the problem. Here's where
the more
legalese
plain
develops.
you get, the less loopholes you cover.
Yeah,
And
that's how
legalese, and that's why I think
legalese is the anti-loophole dialect.
Yes.
The legalese is every time you write a sentence, you think, what are all the possible interpretations of this sentence, and how could that be used against me?
I think to me, one thing that separates it into at least almost its own full language is I think the act of focusing entirely on loopholes actually changes the language dramatically.
But it's
A large focus.
it's not so much loopholes
But I
as
see.
making sure there is no possible way that I can be misinterpreted.
Yeah.
That's
So
the point.
I would put it as a separate language, but in the same family of languages as English. But the dialects, fair enough. But also, okay, I want to talk about English for a second, though,
Okay.
because I actually don't consider English a language.
Well, it's stupid because it's a collection of words that everybody agrees upon their meaning. And
Not even close to everybody agrees, dude. Not even close.
there are a few words that are under dispute, but how we can't have this conversation without agreeing on 95% of the words that we use. We literally
You
could
and I agree on most of the words. But here's the question for you. What defines whether or not a word is in English?
whether or not it's used by English-speaking peoples. It's a little bit of a circular definition.
Okay.
Because it's so societal. It's
What is an English-speaking person?
someone who grows up speaking the language that has historically been considered English.
So, the language that has historically been considered.
It morphs over time.
Dude.
It morphs over time, but it maintains enough of its.
Can I read you some Old English? And you
No, I know. I've read Old English. Old English is a different language than modern English.
Actually, yeah, it is.
It is. It's a different
Very
language.
much is. Because modern English injected a bunch of other languages into it.
Sure.
And it is. I
And
don't think.
therefore created its own new language. It's its own new language with a whole bunch of inspiration from other languages. It's kind of like the America of languages.
I actually disagree. It is like the American languages in a lot of ways. The reason I don't think it qualifies as a language in and of itself, English that is English does not actually have a single set of rules that it follows. It acts like it does. Scholars try to pretend it does, but it follows. Its rule set is like, do this. This is how a word is structured in English. Unless it's of Greek origin, in which case it's this. Or if it's Latin origin, it's this.
But that's still the same set of rules. It's just a very complex set of rules.
It's not even
It's the same set.
It's literally not the same.
Yeah, it is because it's saying, here's a big set of rules.
So, okay, if
This rule applies to this context, this rule applies to this context, this rule applies to this context.
If I'm playing chess, right, and then we want to add checkers to it,
Okay.
and so we have a chessboard and a checkers board, both set up, and we're playing both at the same time. Have we invented a new game?
Well, it depends.
No, we're playing two separate games.
No,
at the same
because
time.
in that context, you're playing them side by side but separately. But that's not an analogy.
Okay, so
The
now
analogy is
when I take
there's a checker piece on the chessboard, and now you're incorporating the checker piece into the chessboard. That's a new language.
See, I don't think.
But it is a
I don't think
language.
that's an analogy.
Your other one wasn't an act analogy. I'm not even sure the game analogy is great anyway, but that's a better one.
I was more trying to talk about the rules. So if I have the chess rules and the checkers rules, and I just decide to use both at the same time, that doesn't intrinsically.
It's the same set of rules. You're not playing a game in which, in some contexts, the checker rules apply, and in other contexts,
But that is
the check
exactly
rules
how English
apply.
works.
I know. That's one set of rules.
So you're saying if I duct tape
It
the
is-
two rule sets together, I've made a new rule set.
Yeah, as long as you define in which contexts this one applies versus this one applies.
So
That's just about what every rule says. It'll drive on the road. In certain contexts, I don't have to follow the speed limit if I'm driving on the Autobahn. In other contexts, I do have to follow the speed limit.
I would argue that it's a different language for all intents and purposes in Germany because they have an Autobahn.
No,
makes
it's
it a
just
different thing.
okay. But if
Their
we
laws are different. So it is
But
a
if
different
we
language.
took the Autobahn and we put it in Texas, we said, here's a highway in Texas, no speed limit.
Mhm.
That's not two separate languages. That's not two separate
There's
rule
a
sets. we've incorporated a new rule into our previously existing rule.
But that's like a sub rule. It's not like an entire rule set that we've integrated. It's just like, let's just turn off this one rule here. That's an exception. That's not a broad.
Okay, but what's the problem with having context-dependent rules? That's all that English
It's
is.
confusing.
Okay, sure, but that doesn't mean that they can't belong to the same set simply because they apply in different contexts.
So
They can be considered part of the same set of rules. It's just just like programming. When you're writing a programming language, it's a bunch of if-then statements, basically, right? You're saying if this, then that. That's context dependent, but it's the same set of rules within your programming language.
depends on the language you use.
I know.
And you
But
can't
it's
pick
the
programming
same-
languages.
I know.
No, you can. It's just you have to jury rig.
I know. But within that particular language, there's a whole bunch of context-dependent rules. In English, there's a whole bunch of context-dependent rules.
So if you're using
And that's
programming example, for if there are any programmers listening, that would be like English would be the equivalent of what would it be the equivalent? There's not an equivalent of what English is in
Okay.
programming languages because you can't, because they don't talk to each other like that.
So perhaps programming
So, well, no, I think it's a fantastic example.
Here-
because they're a good example of, I think, what the definition of a language should be, which I think a language should, here's another thing too. A language should correspond to either a culture or a purpose. I'm adding purposes to include weird languages like programming languages.
Okay.
But if we just talk about human languages that we use to speak to each other,
Okay, well
I think
then
a language
English
should represent a culture.
represents a culture.
I disagree. I think it represents like 12 cultures.
But they're all connected. There's a reason that
But it
Winston Churchill wrote the history of the English-speaking peoples. They are separate
The
and
Romans weren't English-speaking people.
I know. And English is not Roman. English is
It's
not
Latin.
No, it's not.
Fancy
Those are
English
different
is.
languages. No, those are different languages.
Dude,
They
okay,
share
okay.
the same roots,
Take,
but they're different languages.
Okay, so let's see. Latin for give me like a number. Give me a
Oh,
word.
no, I'm going to give you a sentence,
Okay.
not a word. The sentence is, I walk outside in the fall air.
You just picked all English words.
I know. So now translate
Those are
that
all-
into Latin.
No.
Those are not the same words.
They are. That's because you picked English words, not Latin words. Speak.
No?
Pretend you're talking to an academic.
Okay, what's
Say something academic.
Okay.
Like okay. Hold
I'm
on.
not following you. I'm not following.
You picked words that have a Germanic origin. You did not pick a single Latin origin word. So of course it's going to have a different word in Latin.
What's your point? That doesn't.
English is multiple languages smashed together. So
Which thus creates its own specific and distinct
They
language.
don't mix though.
Yes, they do.
No,
Because if I can use a Latin word in the same sentence as a Germanic word, that's all mixing.
So
and if we all understand
if I-
what I'm saying,
if
then it's
I
working.
if I speak fluent Spanish and English and I alternate each word,
That's called Spanglish, and it's its own language.
so you consider Spanglish a language?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
English is another language. Spanglish.
Spanglish does kind of have a culture though.
Yeah, I know.
Let's say I know
My
Spanish.
brother-in-law is Puerto Rican and speaks
Let's say I-
Spanglish. I've talked to him
Let's
about
say I
that.
know like 6 languages,
Okay.
and I just alternate one word in
So
each
you're
language.
Melania drunk?
Okay, sure.
She speaks 7 languages.
There are people that do that. If I know all those languages, do I have my own language? That is a compilation of all those languages in my
No,
brain.
because you're not a culture in and of yourself.
Exactly. So it has to have a culture.
And English has a culture.
What culture? England and America put together?
Plus,
Those are two very different.
but there's enough
So,
connection.
okay.
to associate them all together.
Are you saying that the culture corresponding to English is England, America, France, China,
No.
Japan?
No.
These are all places that use it as one of their primary languages because it's the language of business. Does everyone who speaks English all together, are they just one big?
Those other countries speak it not as the primary language; they speak it as a secondary language.
But
That's very important.
they learn it almost as well.
Okay, but it's still the secondary language. It's not the language in which the government works. It's not the language in which you argue, you write laws, or that's
That's how you
crucial.
define culture.
Yeah, that's a huge part of culture. I'm not going to say that's the only part of culture, but it's a huge part of culture. For example,
I hear that.
when what's his name, William the Conqueror came in and conquered England, and they spoke French in the courts for many years.
Yeah.
That's a different. That's French culture. Now, over time,
And their
England
culture-
developed its own culture
Here's the difference.
that was born out of some influences of France and other influences, but it created its own culture out of the
The French
mixture.
got Latin too, funny enough.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
here's the thing that bugs me, okay, about English. If you talk about French injecting itself into our language, I'm like, sure, that actually became English. Why? Because French people came into England, they mixed for many years, and then they had their language. Now, it was mostly French nobility and English low class, like peasants and stuff. So the languages didn't really, truly, fully mix, but they mixed enough that we have pig and it becomes pork. Because pig is what the poor people raised, and pork is what showed up on the rich person's table. That's
Makes sense.
basically how
Makes sense.
the rich person was French.
Okay.
Um,
I didn't know that etymology, but that's
isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
There's tons of stuff like that. Same with beef and.
But that's the same language.
Well, no, yeah, that's the same language. That then what happened in English, and this is very well documented. I can send you some videos on it if you're interested. We can put the links in the description below too. What happened in English is a bunch of rich scholar dudes got together and they were like, you know what would make English better? Latin. And they're like, as of right now, Latin's part of English. Same with Greek.
I think that's actually an extremely simplified version of the historical development.
No. Literally what happened was scholars got together and decided to inject Latin and Greek into the language. That was not a natural development at all. Romans did not settle England, at least not after King
Yeah,
Arthur.
they did.
Not after King Arthur. Like, it was ages ago. But they
During the time of, it was right after Jesus, I think, when they conquered the island of Britain. Right after
yes,
Jesus.
that
It
was
was during the Emperor Trajan.
before the
Trajan,
development.
however you pronounce it.
Before the development of English. English did not
Yeah.
exist as a language
Yeah.
when the Romans were there.
What's the point of that? I don't
The
know.
point is, Latin, as it is now in English, did not exist in English
Okay,
in that
when
time.
you say Latin is in English, what words have you done? Let's just give me some examples.
Okay.
What do you got?
Conspiracy.
Okay.
Watch this. Conspiracy. I'm typing it into. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Arcane. Latin for arcane is arcane.
So what?
What? Just watch. Mystery. Mysterium.
That's a different word.
No, dude. So it is the different. It's only different because of grammar rules. Nothing else.
But that's a pretty big difference.
Okay,
We don't
what-
end our words with eum all the time the way they did. We don't end our words with eum in that context the way they did. Mystery. Okay, mysterium. Yeah, we'll use that word sometimes.
It is. It's a like you can talk about.
So the fact that we use some Latin
Brandon.
words sometimes doesn't mean that English
Any
is a
Latin-
distinct language.
any Latin word at all, you can put it into English, and because Latin is so ingrained in English as its own separate thing, you barely have to change it.
Okay, that doesn't mean that English is not its own distinct language. That doesn't mean that. You're not actually
I
making your point.
Sorry, you're right. I'm not making my point. My point is that Latin does not correspond to 90% of the cultures in America.
Mysterium?
Latin. Latin is a academic
Okay.
English thing.
So
If you
what
talk-
you're
imagine-
saying-
wait, imagine a random homeless person on the street. Walk up to them, ask them if they've heard of the arcane mysterium. They'll be like, "What the heck are you talking about? I don't know what those words mean."
Okay.
They don't know those words
So
because they
what
are
you are
academic.
so what you are saying
Academia.
is that there were certain aspects of English that were added in a very contrived way.
Absolutely.
That doesn't mean English isn't its own language.
No. So
It
much
just
so-
means that there are some aspects of it that are contrived.
What I'm
I'd be willing to bet money that you go to any language, you're going to find aspects of it that are very contrived. I'd be willing to bet money. I don't speak their language, so I don't know.
I'm processing. I'm thinking about it. There's
So there are aspects to English that are a bit contrived. You know what's contrived?
You're
Kwanzaa. That's contrived. That doesn't mean that I don't know what you're saying when you use the word Kwanzaa.
I mean, no, to be honest, half the time.
It's this stupid holiday.
No, it's a holiday. We're not.
It's a holiday invented by a godless communist woman abuser torturer who was put in prison for torturing women.
Yeah.
Um,
So, but what I'm trying to say, because you're kind of derailing to a different argument. What I'm trying to say is English does not have a cohesive culture attached to it because the whole language. So you've got the English that is based on the Germanic/French English. That is what's spoken by regular folks, people who don't go to college, people who drop out of high school, people who grow up in like a trailer out in the wilderness somewhere or out off in Appalachia. Those people speak a version of English such that if an academic was to come and talk to them about taxonomy, for example, not an English word, or something like that, they would be very confused because they don't know the Latin words because they didn't get educated. You can only learn Latin by education. If you want to talk in a way that is very understandable to people who are lower income or just in general lower IQ, lower education, you have to not use Latin or Greek because they don't know it. Because the only way to access that is education because it's a fake part of the language.
You don't think poor people don't know what taxidermy is?
Just taxidermy or taxonomy?
Oh, taxonomy. I heard taxidermy.
Oh.
I was like, what are you talking about? Rednecks don't do taxidermy? Like, I
Well,
don't
they do. They don't know what it means. They just know it means make pelt into long-lasting pelt. They don't know the meaning of the word.
Most people who speak English don't know the etymology of the words they speak. That doesn't mean English isn't a language.
That's because most of the words in English that are actually of English origin and not Latin or Greek, most of those words, the etymology is that this has been the word for centuries.
That doesn't mean that English is not its own separate
What I'm
language.
trying to say is it's not a language, it's a composite language. It is not indicative
What you're
of
essentially saying is
it
there's
is multiple
an
languages.
academic dialect that is different from the common dialect.
It's an academic language because people who speak
It's the same argument about legalese.
people who speak legalese are bilingual in legalese or academic whatever. People who speak the academic language are bilingual in academic language and English. Speaking as one of those people, I understand this. I know many people who I talk to and their eyes glaze over and they have no idea what I said because I'm speaking academic. Literally, a bunch of people genuinely do not have it as part of their language, and therefore that part of the language does not represent that culture. But that culture is part of America.
It's a different dialect. Because
No, it's not a dialect because they can't understand it no matter how much time they speak. They don't know the words.
Okay, but if the words, okay, so you're saying essentially the words should not be you're saying Latin words should not be considered to be included in the corpus of the English language.
Latin and Greek.
Okay, that is different than saying English is not a language.
I'm saying it's a composite language. It's not a true language because it does not have a matching culture.
But it does.
No, it has a bunch of matching cultures that do not overlap as much as the language wants to suggest.
They overlap enough.
So if the letters in the words matter, we and England don't even speak the same language. They spell their words differently.
Okay,
They pronounce them differently too. They have an accent because they pronounce them differently.
but the differences are dialect differences, not language. The difference between American English and British English is a difference of dialect, not a difference
So
of
what's the
language.
difference between dialect and language? 'Cause
Degree. It's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree. If you deviate a certain amount, you got a dialect. If you deviate more, you've got a different language.
Okay, I want to show you something. This guy, his name is Niall Wilson. Sorry.
Okay.
He is a British gymnast. He's from Middle England,
Okay.
meaning between Scotland and London.
Okay.
Just listen to his accent for a minute
Okay.
after the ad.
You get ads. That's fine.
Yeah. I don't want to pay. It's been free forever, and I don't want to pay.
Oh, I don't pay for my. I've told you.
You randomly got it.
I've got a weird glitch, and I don't know. Maybe if YouTube hears this, they'll change it. In fact, I'm kind of just wanting to experiment, so I will tell you. I've got a weird glitch in my YouTube. I don't get ads. I don't pay for anything. I just don't get ads. Period.
It's funny.
Maybe YouTube will hear this and change that. I don't know. Okay, show me this guy's dialogue.
I just want to say my book, The Lessons, is available for free on it.
How much of that do you understand?
My new book, The Lessons, is available for pre-order.
Yeah, you can kind of understand it if you really focus.
No, I can understand that perfectly well. That's called an accent, Reagan. That's not a different language. I can understand that perfectly fine. What's your problem?
So,
He's using the same words. He's just speaking with a different accent.
where I was trying to go with this, before you jump to a spurious conclusion,
Okay.
was this is him not using his dialect. It's actually hard to find times of him using his dialect. So you would call this an accent, not a dialect.
Yeah, that's because he's
Okay.
using the same words that I would.
So
just an accent.
there are times when he slips into his dialect with his friends, and unless you have subtitles, you really just can't.
Oh, I'm sure. I've heard the real the South London accent that is really more of a dialect than an accent.
Yeah. So
I agree with it. In it,
to
they
me, it seems
they
like
endeavor
you're
to finish with in it.
stuff like that.
That's a dialect.
My question is what is the line? I'm really.
I don't think I don't think it's easy to draw a bright line. I think it's kind of a.
Because I don't understand your mental map of how language works.
I don't think it's easy to draw a bright line between what kind of deviation constitutes a dialect versus what degree of deviation constitutes a different language. But
you're saying the words have no meaning. There's no meaning, but what a dialect's just whatever you want it to be. Whatever feels right.
No, that's not what I'm
You're
saying.
saying you can't draw a line.
No, I'm saying it's hard to draw a line, and it's not going to be a bright line. It's going to be a bit gray.
That
doesn't mean there isn't a line. It's just it's hard to place exactly where the line is.
Sometimes, but what's your definition? What is a dialect?
Okay,
define it. Like, what are you even?
I'll define a dialect versus a language the same way I would define a mountain versus a ridge. A ridge a ridge is a lump that's smaller than a mountain.
No, a ridge actually has a very specific definition.
Okay, then perhaps I should say hill instead of ridge.
Okay, a hill and a mountain is
yes.
A hill
is
basically a cliff.
Oh, fair enough.
It's a little more nuanced.
A hill is a lump that is smaller than a mountain. A mountain is a lump that is bigger than a hill. Mm-hmm. You kind of define them with each other.
Sure.
That's how I would use language versus dialect. A dialect, you call something a dialect of a certain language when it has enough linkage with the father language that there's still some sort of general understandability, but it's different enough that it may be hard to understand.
By that logic, if you exclude Latin and Greek, and maybe French too, depending on how detailed you want to get, then modern English is a dialect of Old English, not a separate language.
Perhaps you're right.
Okay.
Perhaps you're right. That may be true. I don't know enough about Old English to know.
Yeah. So,
but that could be the case. Here's the kind of the core text.
The word for ship is ship, by the way.
Okay, so maybe not. I don't know.
A lot of things like man is man.
Okay. So
woman, I think, is woman. Wife is wife. Although it meant other things. Husband actually comes from housebond.
Oh.
Yeah.
So here's my point. If you imagine a big ball of Play-Doh, okay, a dialect where you take a piece of that Play-Doh and kind of stretch it off and create a smaller ball. There's still a connection though. There's still a connection. When it becomes a different language is when
the last little bit breaks off.
The last little bit breaks off. Now, printed.
But there's always still a connection.
Well, yeah, it's still the same substance. You know, it has the same DNA, so to speak, because you pulled it off of the father. But it is now so distinct that if you're living on this larger planet and you hop over to the smaller Play-Doh planet, you're not going to understand what's going on. If you hop over to the dialect planet that still has the connection, you're going to understand it enough to get by. But at a certain point, that connection severs. If I go into Mexico...
Are we talking about reading and writing, or are we talking about...
Communication in general.
Well, no, speaking and reading and writing are all very different.
Well, I'm talking about communication.
If you're speaking, then accent also plays into it.
Yes, yeah, you're right, it does. Okay. But what I'm saying, here's the point I'm trying to make. If I go to South London, it's going to be hard for me to understand what people are saying.
Yeah.
But I'll be able to get by picking out enough words. I know I will, because
if they change to speaking regular English, you definitely could.
No,
if they are bilingual, I would say. Or
no,
I think that is.
I've heard enough South Londoner to know that I'd be able to get by. If I go to Mexico City, I don't know enough to get by.
So here's the question: is the word mysterium actually, ignore that. Is for a dialect, does a dialect have to contain all of those same words as the main language? And
not
can it have
necessarily.
I think if something is a dialect, does that?
I think the core depends on understandability. I think that's the core.
Okay.
Am I going to be able to understand enough? Is the average person from language A going to be able to understand enough about language B that they can get by without, previous study? If yes, then it's not actually a language B, it's a dialect. If no, it's a totally different language. That's really the line.
See that I don't know if that quite works, because you
If
got
I
like,
go into Montreal and they speak French,
well,
I won't be able to get by.
French is French
Yeah.
is obviously different. Like,
But if I
except that
go,
it's not because but it is.
It
We actually combined those in a very real way.
yes,
And there were some I will grant you there were some scholars did artificially combine some of the apply some English grammar to some of the Latin and Greek words.
and that's
There is-
fine. None of that really matters to the calculation at all. It's about understandability because
Okay.
language is about communication.
Yeah.
Am I going to be able to understand what these people are saying?
If so,
If I can get by, even if maybe I struggle to understand, it's a dialect.
so
but if I can't get by, the culture comes into play in the sense that if I'm in American culture and I go to South London, there's still enough similarity that I know what people are saying.
So when you say American culture, you are
I'm saying the United States of America.
I know, and by that you are specifically talking about the suburban southeastern culture.
No, because no matter where I go in the United States, I will, unless I'm going into some like Haitian migrant community or something.
Or like
Or China.
West Virginia.
No, I will be able to understand it enough in certain parts.
Most places.
Will I be able? Will I understand greatly? No, but I will be I will be able to understand enough to get by. It's easier for me to understand the West Virginia dialect than it is for me to understand South Boston or something like that. But if I go to South Boston and I listen to those guys, or Maine, like really rural Maine, I'll know enough to get by. Okay, so those are different dialects. There are all sorts of different dialects across the United States,
Obviously.
but it's all wrapped up in the same language.
See,
And then
I think I agree with.
yeah, and so here's the thing: those dialects are all sub-dialects of the dialect of American English, which is a separate dialect than British English. And British English has sub-dialects like South Londoner, all that sort of stuff. So there's sub-dialects that you can kind of go down the list. But at the end of the day, it does all fall within the same umbrella of English. And that's my only point.
Are you including in that all the Latin and Greek stuff? Because that's my biggest thing.
I don't
think
know.
Latin and Greek have no place
If that's your argument, then I don't.
They turn it from a language into a composite language.
No. They don't.
I don't think
turn
it's
it.
really integrated in the language.
You're,
I don't think
you're
it's
jumping to conclusions. You're saying what you're saying is because these words were added through contrivance rather than natural
you're
evolution,
reducing it.
they don't belong here. Therefore, it's not a language anymore. That jumps,
I'm
and I
saying
don't
it
get.
does not represent the culture of America to include Latin.
So what you're
They're-
saying is
they're
Latin is
small.
not a part of English. That's all you're saying.
Latin and Greek, yes.
That's different than saying English is not a language. You're just saying Latin is not a part of English.
Okay, so
You're
you are,
saying that some people speak Latin and
you are
English.
literalizing my words in a way that I was not intending.
Okay.
So when I'm saying English, I'm talking about the thing most people refer to when they say English, which is every language that calls itself English in the whole world. They're not all the same. People who speak, people in a laboratory, what they are saying to each other, a lot of it is depending on the lab, I guess, but a lot of what they're going to be talking about is like Greek and Latin stuff. And someone who's like grown up in the inner city in a rough neighborhood won't understand a word they're saying.
They'll
Are
understand
they-
enough.
No, they literally won't. I've had these conversations. It's literally my job.
Do you
These
know how to
people do not
communicate
understand.
where the bathroom is? Do you know how to communicate?
That's
I am
not-
feeling a certain way.
The things that you are saying, well, obviously this is English, are the English Germanic words. Those are absolutely English.
So all you're saying is that Latin is Latin and English is English.
No, that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying Latin and Greek are not actually in English.
That's true.
But, geez, your yelling is making it hard to think. So I'm trying to say that when most people say English, they are, okay, when non-academic people say English, what they are thinking of, their encyclopedic definition, is all the
without
words
the
they
Latin.
know.
Uh-huh.
It's all the words they know, which doesn't include, it'll include some Latin, sure, because it just gets thrown around by academic people or everywhere. But it hasn't truly integrated into the culture.
Okay.
I was going to use an
So
example.
that doesn't mean English isn't a language, though.
No,
That's not what that means.
you're totally misunderstanding the point.
Okay.
Stop fixating.
Okay. Okay.
So when I say English is not a language, I'm not saying it's not a mode of communication that is shared among many people.
But that's what a language is.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we use the word language too broadly. And English has different definitions depending on where you go. And as such, there is not a cohesive definition of English except in dictionaries. And dictionaries include Latin and Greek into that because they feel obligated to include every word anyone has ever
It's
used.
cohesive enough wherever you go in the English-speaking world. Yes, it is.
No.
If I can go into your community and ask where the bathroom is, we have a shared language.
English, Latin. Okay, give me only. Okay, ask where the bathroom is in English using only words of Latin or Greek descent.
You can't.
Exactly, because they're not English. That's my point.
I agree
And
with
by
you.
including them into English,
You're not tainting
You are-
English. You're
lying about the language. The definition is incorrect. That's not English anymore, but we call it English.
okay.
English
Fair
means
enough. That
both.
doesn't mean English doesn't exist.
English as a concept means different things to different people, and as such, it is not a cohesive concept, and therefore is not a true language because it doesn't represent a culture.
Okay.
It is
It does represent a culture.
no. Which culture? Which culture does English belong to? Give me one culture that it belongs to.
The
A
general,
cohesive culture.
the English-speaking cultures. So that's
It doesn't have a specific group. Me and English people are not the same group of people.
there's enough connection though to warrant a similar culture. There are a motherland.
They have
England is the motherland of all of the other English-speaking countries.
Okay.
They're the motherland of
So
America and Canada and Australia.
So what you're basically saying
So that-
is English, the definition of English then is that anyone who came from England speaks English. We might as well include India in that because they
Actually, India does speak a lot of English.
They do.
Yeah.
I know. So does South Africa.
Yeah, but
But they don't
it's
always
the secondary languages to them.
Oh
Oh no, not in South Africa.
Yeah.
But in India, it's
In
secondary.
India, I think it partially depends on where you go, but yeah, there's nuance there.
But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean English isn't a language. That's where I'm missing you.
What you're missing is you're fixating on me saying English isn't the language. What I'm saying is,
But that's what you said, and that's what you've been arguing.
fixating on that instead of hearing me expand. What
Okay.
I'm trying to say is, because I'm trying to elaborate on it, because clearly the way I presented it did not make sense to you.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is, English is not
It's a
it's
weird
not-
language?
English is not a language in the same way that any other language.
It's a unique
It
language.
is a completely unique language.
Oh,
is-
that I can agree with.
It might actually be a pidgin language, arguably. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. I'm not going to do that.
I can agree with it
Um,
being a very unique language.
I'm saying
Yeah.
it's a unique language.
That's
So much so that I think we need a new term to describe it because I don't think language is sufficient to describe the complexity that is English.
that is a different argument.
That's what I've been trying to make this whole time.
Okay. Now that you've established it,
Yes.
I think there's that.
That's why I say it's not a language because the term language predates all of our
Well,
languages.
but you are declaring something as truth when really what you're actually doing is saying it should be truth. So what you're saying is
I'm saying a truth. I'm saying the labels that we use don't match the truth of the situation.
you're making an argument for using different labels, but the way you're arguing is these different labels are already the proper way, and we're using improper labels.
Yeah, basically
So you're trying to convince people that we need a new word. Yeah, that we need a new word to define something, but the way you're doing it is by saying the word already exists. That's my issue.
So what I'm trying to say is, I think the way when people say the core of what I'm getting at, and this is something that I deal with on a regular basis, interacting with.
Okay.
The core of what I deal with is when people say English, they are referring to different languages, and I say that based on the fact that they cannot communicate with each other. Two people can be speaking English and not have more than like 3 words in common. Can they have to go to the bathroom? Sure, maybe.
They have more than 3 words.
Obviously.
Okay, I'll actually give you a great example.
Okay.
You saw Am I Racist, right?
Yes.
I thought it.
Very,
Great movie, highly recommended.
very, very fun.
There's one part in which Matt takes his academic lingo
Mhm.
and goes to poorer communities
Yes.
that don't speak academic. And he uses words like, systemic and
Yeah.
all that kind of
Which
stuff.
that's a Latin word.
Okay,
System is a Latin word,
okay.
if I'm not mistaken.
And the people he's using these words with don't understand what he's saying.
Also, ironically, compound is also a Latin word, and I was using that in compound language. So I even used Latin to
Okay.
describe. Anyway,
So the point I'm trying to make is Matt Walsh goes into the biker bar and he goes into the ghetto of New Orleans, and he has conversations with people. And when he uses the academic language,
The Latin terms.
they don't know what he's talking about. That's true.
Because that's
But they're still having a conversation.
yes, but those
They
words
can
were
still
not
have it.
English.
Okay,
He didn't
Fine.
put English to them.
fine. But there's still enough common ground between them that they can generate enough of that, communicate enough ideas in
Common
between
ground
them.
is called English.
Okay, so then we go back to, so you're just saying Latin doesn't belong in English, which I think is fine. I think
It's
I
more.
can
It's
agree.
more
Latin is Latin and English is English.
you're being overly reductive about it, but yes, essentially.
I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think when you see Matt Walsh trying to communicate these Latin terms
Mhm.
to like the biker bar people
Who speak English.
who speak English, you can an interesting dialect to make.
Oh yeah, sure, it's a dialect, but it's English.
Yeah.
They speak English.
You can tell where the moment of disconnection happens
It's
when he
when
starts
he-
using
it's
Latin
Latin.
terms. And so, therefore, you make the argument Latin doesn't belong in English.
Stop
Latin is
calling
Latin, English is English.
Stop calling
Fair.
that.
Fair point.
That's my.
That's true. Okay.
And if
That I can totally agree with.
English, when people say
Latin is
English,
Latin, English is English.
they're referring to all the words in the English dictionary, which includes Latin.
I think that
That's what
undercuts your other argument. Because what you're saying is when people who speak English don't use Latin. But then you're also saying, but when people say the word English, they include Latin words.
Yes, but they
That's
don't.
not true.
No, they when they like okay. If you
No,
were to
you ask those biker guys.
if you were to go and ask them, how do you know which words are in English? They go the dictionary, obviously.
No, they go, I know English. They
No.
probably go based on, I guarantee you none of them have picked up a dictionary. They go based on the language that they learned from their parents and from their community.
Well, sure.
And that doesn't include Latin. So they would not include Latin in the definition of English. I guarantee you.
That's
That really
that's a-
fat dude with the
that
beard.
supports my point even more.
Exactly. And that's why I said you were undercutting your point with what you said. So I think you're right there. That fat dude
You
with the
went
beard.
different than I was intending.
Okay. The fat dude with the beard,
Yeah.
who you could barely understand a word he said. That guy would tell you Latin is Latin, English is English. Those Latin words this idiot is speaking is not English.
Yeah.
And he'd be right.
And the reason I'm passionate about this is because a lot of people disagree with that very vehemently.
But I think you're right. I think you're right.
Cool.
I agree. And as a side note, I don't know if you noticed this. That guy reminded me a lot of Uncle Jim.
I can totally see it.
We haven't, if you watch the movie,
Yeah.
you get to the biker bar with the fat biker
Yeah.
who goes in the trailer. He's the guy that goes, "Ah." That guy.
Yeah.
You know, we have family members that we come from Appalachia.
Yep.
That is a very
Very
common
much
sight.
so.
And you know what? I love my culture. I love Appalachia. It's great.
Yeah.
So I think we've actually resolved that conflict, and that was a very riveting discussion.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed it. We actually did enjoy fighting about it.
Yes.
We can get heated, and we actually love
Let
it.
us know in the comments below what you think.
Yeah.
Is Latin part of English or is it not?
I'd be interested to
Is
get up and talk
academia a language of its own that is Latin and Greek inserted into English?
I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts on this because I think it is actually a fairly nuanced topic.
Yeah.
So let us know.
What culture do you think English represents? I'm sure that won't be spicy at all.
There's a whole other conversation in that we won't get to now.
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in on our conversation about linguistics. That's just that's how it came up. This was a day about linguistics.
Yeah.
So thanks for tuning in. We'll hope to see you next week or next month, whenever we post a new one.
Whatever it is, yeah.
And that will be the world from Grandma's Attic. It will be Grandma's Attic next time.
Yeah.
But I hope you enjoyed the world from Reagan's Garage. And like and subscribe and all that good stuff.
Oh yes, don't forget to do that.
Yeah.